meeting is being recorded.
If we go to the next slide, please, Belinda. So thank you so much, everyone, for coming along at the start of what is no doubt a busy carers week for everyone. We've got a really packed agenda today. We've got a lot we're going to be trying to cram in into the next 2.5 hours from a research perspective, from a practice and also policy as well. I won't go into the agenda in detail. You should all have that in the joining instructions that I sent round as well. Before each speaker, I'll do a very brief introduction, but you can see all of their biographies in the joining instructions pack as well, just to try and give as much time for discussion and sharing best practice and learning today from that perspective. So it's my job to start by welcoming everyone and setting the scene and doing a bit of housekeeping. So I can take to the next slide, please, Belinda. So just a bit of housekeeping. So please could you ensure your microphones are on mute if you're not speaking at any point today, just to enable no sort of background interference. As I said, we are recording the session. Now that people are in the room, please do introduce yourself in the chat. Make use of the chat. There will be time for questions and answers later on today as well. If we don't get a chance to get to any of the questions today, we will follow them all up after the event. The slides will be going on the Young Carers Alliance website, on the resources page. And as I said, we'll be making the recording available and also the extract from the chat as well from that perspective. And for those of you who are on Twitter, we are on there as Young Carers Alliance and also Caring Together, the organisation who I work for. And the hashtag, obviously, for this week is Carers Week. So please do tweet, please do interact as we go through this afternoon's event. So I can take to the next slide, please. So just to sort of set the scene. So for people who don't know me, I'm Andy McGowan. I'm the Head of Engagement at Caring Together. So we're a charity who support young carers, young adult carers and adult carers in Cambridgeshire, Peterborough and Norfolk. But we do a lot of work raising awareness of sort of the needs of young carers and young adult carers on that sort of that national scale as well. And we've got a lot of great speakers today. We've got a lot of expertise from a research background, some great practice examples and also some policy examples as well, all of which will hopefully really help people's learning and understanding of some of the issues. But I was really keen, we actually started off with hearing directly from young carers or young adult carers themselves. So I'm absolutely delighted that Axel has kindly agreed to take a break from their final assignment at university for their year to come and join us today. So I won't say too much about Axel, but Axel is a young adult carer who's been involved in our Norfolk Young Carers Forum project for a number of years, so helping to raise awareness and improve support for young carers across Norfolk. And for World University Mental Health Day, Axel took part in a question and answer for a blog, and you can see the link there from that perspective. But I was really keen just to do a bit of a question and answer with Axel, just for them to be able to share their experience of being a young adult carer and that transition to university as well. So Axel, as I said, thank you ever so much for joining today. Do you want to start? I'm just going to make sure everyone else is muted so that everyone can hear you. But do you just want to start by just sharing a bit about your sort of caring journey, a bit about in terms of how you came to becoming a young carer?
Yeah, so I have been caring since I was about 5. When I was 5, my mum had her appendix out. It's been me and her my entire life. She had her appendix out when I was 5, so I was looking after her after the surgery. And then she developed a hearing condition. She develops tumours in her ear called cholesteatomas. And so she has to have regular head surgeries for that. So I've been her carer since then for that. And she's also got like back issues and arthritis and things like that. I like to say that she's got issues from her head to her toes when I describe it.
And obviously you've just started at university in terms of in this year. What was that? What was that like? That transition going from being at home in Norfolk to sort of going to university. What sort of was it something you looked forward to? Were there any things you were really worried about from that sense?
Yeah, so I've always wanted to go to university. It's always kind of been a dream of mine. So I've been like, it's always something I've looked forward to. However, with all the different conditions and stuff that my mum developed over the years, it kind of, I was worried it would become like less and less realistic for me to go. But mum was adamant on me going. So when it actually came down to looking at them, I ended up choosing one that's not even that far away. So because I'm from South Norfolk, I was either going to go to UEA or Uni of Suffolk. Chose Uni of Suffolk because then it gives me my distance and like the development into adulthood, as well as still only being like an hour or so away from mum if she needs me.
And how did you find that sort of, which was the biggest? Was it the practical side of going to university? Because anyone going to university has the things of, actually, how do I get all of my stuff from home to university? How much stuff can I physically fit into my room from university? Student finance. These are all things that sort of most young people going to university have to think through. But for young carers, sometimes it can be the additional practical pressures that actually, will I need to go back and forth to check on mum until actually, okay, maybe mum's not able to work as much. So finances is a area that I'm more worried than possibly some of my friends are from that perspective. Or for some young carers, it can be that emotional side of going to university that actually, well, okay, what happens if mum has a bad day? Who's going to support mum? Or actually, I do these things for mum at home. How's that going to work in practice? How was your experience? Was it more the practical side, the emotional side, a bit of both?
It was kind of a bit of everything. So I'm in my third of 4 years. So my first year and a half, I'd say here, I was like using some of my student finance to help mum with rent and stuff like that, because she was really struggling with it. But as well as that, it was kind of, because I do like cleaning and different things and stuff like that. But I was very lucky in the fact that my mum got help from Early Help Hub. And so she's got a PA now who will help her do shopping and things like that. So I can kind of take a step back from worrying about that. But I'm still kind of there if she needs the emotional support. Like, it's just a phone call away, things like that. But with all the prices of things going up now, I have started to kind of help her with finances a bit again. I got a message from her the other day being like, can you send me some money? And I was like, absolutely. Because I'm very grateful that I've got student finance coming in and I'm working a part-time job as well. So I can afford to support her with finance and stuff.
You've raised a really interesting sort of almost role reversal there, in terms of actually traditionally and arguably stereotypically, people often say, oh, people away at university will be ringing and asking for the bank of mum or dad or parent or grandparent, whoever, to help them out because their student loan doesn't go far enough or whatever. But you're obviously talking about the other way around, about actually home contacting you and asking to help financially from that perspective. And you also touched on, in terms of some of that financial and practical support, what is it that you think actually really made the difference? What enabled you to go to university? What's helped when you've been at university, or what could other universities do to make it better for young carers from your experience?
It really depends, because my university, I love my university, but they are not the best in terms of support for students with additional needs, students with extra responsibilities, whether that's families, caring, work, anything like that. So it has very much been a case of I've had to figure a lot of stuff out on my own. Yeah. I'm very grateful for Caring Together. I don't think I'd have got through the years of uni so far if I didn't have you guys at the end of the phone as well. Belinda, I love Belinda with my whole heart. She's been at the end of the phone when I need her. But I definitely think that with the support from Early Help Hub and knowing that mum's got that personal assistant there to help her with cleaning, to help her on her bad days, it has helped a lot in knowing that I can kind of take a step back from that.
And I think you've really summed up the importance of, and that's going to be a theme coming throughout today, is getting that support in place that enabled you. So the fact that, great, the Early Help Hub got involved, that's exactly what should be happening. That's what the system should be doing. So in the room, we've got a mixture of people from carer organisations, from local authorities, from health, from education, universities. Is there a message that you'd like to give to the room as to actually what they can do or what they need to be thinking about to help make that transition better for young adult carers?
I think just making sure that you're listening to young carers, because I think a lot of the time we feel like we're not being listened to. I know that, especially with my uni, like, because I was the Students with Caring Responsibilities Liberation Officer for almost 3 years. And it was just, we felt like we weren't being listened to. And it was really difficult to actually find someone to listen to. And that wasn't going, okay, so this is what your problem is. This is what someone similar went through. So I'm going to do the exact same thing. Because that's something I found, is that people were like, oh, you were kind of similar to this person, so do this and it'll be fine. But not everyone is the same.
No, and I think you've really articulately summed up that need, both for listening to young adult carers, but also looking at their individual needs. So there will never be a one-size-fits-all. Axel, I know you're in the middle of an assignment, your final assignment of the year, which will enable you to finish for summer. So I'm ever so grateful for you giving your time up to come and join today. Obviously, you're more than welcome to stay for the rest of the session if you want to distract yourself from that said assignment. But definitely, I'm really, really grateful for you coming to join. And no doubt, if people have ever got any questions for Axel, if they want to get in touch with us, Caring Together, then we can put some of those questions to Axel once they finish their assignment and start enjoying their summer. But Axel, huge thank you for opening today's session with me. I really do appreciate it from that perspective.
Thank you.
So now, in terms of, we go on to our next speaker to focus on what are some of the issues actually following on from what Axel said about that transitions from a research perspective. So I'm delighted and really grateful to have Professor Saul Becker joining us today. So Saul Becker is one of the world's, if not the world's, expert and pioneer in research, policy and practice for young carers. He's recently been appointed the Professor of Children and Families at Manchester Metropolitan University, has held a host of roles at different organisations as well. Saul always sets himself the challenge of how many slides can he get through in a 20-minute time slot. So I'm not going to eat into any more of his time, and I'll hand over to Saul.
Thanks, Andy. I hope everyone can I just check that everyone can hear me? And that's great. Andy, and you're changing the slides, I'm assuming?
Belinda is from my team, yeah, she's lined up to do it.
Thanks. Thank you, Belinda. So what I want to do in the next 20 minutes is to talk about, obviously, transitions of young carers and draw on 3 or 4 studies that I've conducted in 2000, 22 years ago, 2008, 2013 and 2021. And what I want to do is tell you a story about young carers' transitions at different stages. So if I can have the first slide, please. The first publication I wrote on transitions was in 2000. It was called Growing Up Caring. And then I followed that in 2008 with a report called Young Adult Carers in the UK. And there is a link between these 2 reports, because when I wrote the first one, Growing Up Caring, this was really about the whole issue of young carers and looking at their different needs at different stages of their childhood. But of course, what we were discovering by the end of that sort of decade was that when many young carers became 18, the caring didn't stop. They continued to care from childhood into adulthood. And that's when we termed the phrase young adult carers. And the report Young Adult Carers in the UK, which was published in 2008, was effectively a recognition that we needed to think not just about children as carers, but young adults as carers, given that they continue to care throughout childhood and into adulthood. But basically, those 2 reports showed that most children who had cared, who were young carers, would continue to care then into adulthood. It didn't just stop when they were 18, even though children's services did. And it pointed out that there was a real issue of transitions, but also of what kinds of support young carers would get when they became adults. We also discovered in those 2 reports that families expected young carers to do more as they got older. And as children got from 12 to 15 to 16 to 17, they were having to do more in their families. We discovered that schools were not particularly supportive, that there was a lack of career advice, that young carers had educational problems, and that many were starting to say that leaving home was very problematic. How could you leave home if there was no one else available to provide care? So thinking about going to college or to university was fraught with difficulties. And we also discovered in those two reports that specific transition support was needed for young carers, particularly around the ages of 15, 16 and 17, when they're starting to transition into adulthood. And in that period, 2008, it was very clear that most young carers projects, because they finished working with people at 18, didn't do terribly much work at that time on transition work into adulthood. And indeed, since 2008 and the publication of Young Adult Carers in the UK, we now have a whole new area of work with young adult carers alongside young carers. Now, the key point that I want to make from these two reports and this early work, which was, nearly 20 odd years ago, was that at that time we were talking about transitions to adulthood. That's really what transitions was all about. And by transitions to adulthood, we're talking really about moving away from dependence for their primary emotional and financial support from their family carers, in other words, from parents or adults within their own home, and looking towards independence, their own families, their own lives, going to university, etc., etc. So it was important to emphasize at that stage the need for looking at transition to adulthood and the development of new services, young adult carer services that would support children who were carers into adulthood. But the key thing to remind people is that whilst that was the focus 20 years ago, we now recognize, all of us, that transitions are not just about transition to adulthood. There are a whole series of other transitions that young carers have, from primary to secondary school to college and university, as we just heard from Alex. We've got transitions from university and college to paid employment, transitions to independent lives, transitions to your own family life, and et cetera, et cetera. And each of these transition stages or phases raises implications for the kinds of support that young carers and young adult carers need. Next slide, please. I just wanted to remind us of the 2011 census, because we haven't got the 2021 census data yet, which shows that children of a very young age, 5, 6 and 7, 8 and 9, primary school age kids are doing care. This is according to the census and adults or parents' own disclosure of their children caring. So it seriously underestimates the numbers of young carers of those ages, because as I've always said, the census doesn't count all the children that would be carers if they self-identified using the MACA or other instruments. But what this I've put this slide up just to remind you that when you've got children as young as 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, etc., who are providing 50 hours of care or more a week, or 20 to 49 hours of care, and you can see the figures there, that raises serious implications about their primary school participation. And because they're caring from such an early age, their transitions not to adulthood, but through primary school into secondary school and everything else. And one of the points I want to make is that when you look at those kind of figures, we really do have to think about trying to reduce or prevent inappropriate or excessive caring amongst primary school kids in particular, because that becomes institutionalized. And because families expect more and more caring as children get older, if that's what they're expecting for primary school kids, you can see that the expectations will grow as those children get older. It's a theme I'll come back to later on. Next slide, please. So let me talk about a survey we did in 2013, which looks at young carers aged 14 upwards to 25. So it covers 14 to 25-year-olds. And the reason why I want to focus on this survey for a few minutes is because it looks at young carers at school, it looks at young carers at college and university, it looks at young adult carers in work, and it looks at young adult carers who are not in employment, education, or training. So it covers the whole transitional phase from secondary school right through to paid employment, or actually not employment, not education, not training, and so on. Next slide. What you can see from this slide, from this survey, next slide please, it was published in 3 reports, is that the age that they started caring was very young, age of 10. Next slide please. If you look at the young adult carers still at school, this is the 14 to 17-year-olds, 61 of those young adults were at school, and 48% were enjoying school. The majority said they were doing well, half said that they were recognised at school, but nearly half had no recognition or help, and a quarter said they were being bullied because of caring. Next slide, please. 92% of those school pupils said that they would like to go to university. They had an aspiration to go to university, but a quarter thought that they wouldn't be able to afford to go to university. They had no real understanding of the financial system of grants and fees, etc., etc. Next slide, please. If you look now at the group of 101 young adult carers who were actually at college or university, so these were the ones who were aged 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, etc. And we had 101 of those in this survey. 79% said they were enjoying college or university. 69% said they were actually doing well. A third, and this is a finding consistent across the world, were on a caring course. A lot of young adults who go on to college or go on to university do a course that's related to caring because they feel that they're carrying skills and knowledge that they've achieved or acquired through caring that will help them in a particular course. 46% said that they had recognition, but of course that means that the majority said that they don't have any recognition or help. And 16% were worried that they may have to drop out because of their caring role. Next slide, please. However, due to their caring role, 29% did drop out, and 56%, over half, said that they were experiencing difficulties of managing studying, being a student at college or university, and caring, with nearly 30% dropping out. And this is a tragedy, particularly for university students who drop out because of the fees that they've already paid and acquired, and the debt that they will have already acquired from university, and then they drop out and have to start something else, whether it's in the paid labour market or whatever. Next slide, please. Now, this is an important figure, an important table, because we were able to then calculate from that sample the amount of time that school children, college and university students, and people in the paid labour market, all of whom are young adult carers, actually had affected by caregiving roles, and the amount of days that they were actually missing school, college, or work because of their caring roles. So if we just take the first column, school, we can see that a quarter of all school days were affected by caring, and that in our sample, 5% of school days were actually missed. By the time young adults get to college and university, half of all the days at college or university are affected by their caring, and 3 days per month were missed. And by the time people were getting into the labour market, the paid labour market, 79 days per year were affected, and 17 days per year were lost because of caring. Now, what this tells us is that as people transition from school to college, to university, and to paid work, there is a cumulative increase in the numbers of days that people are affected by caring and may have to miss college or university or work. So transitions are not just a matter for education in terms of primary to secondary to university, etc., but it's also important about the whole transitions to university and to the paid labour market, because accessing paid employment and keeping paid employment as a young adult carer will require sensitivity and a carer-friendly attitude and mindfulness amongst employers, just as much as it will amongst universities, just as much as it will amongst colleges, just as much as it will amongst schools. Because if we're not sensitive to the specific caring needs and the outcomes of caring on young people throughout all of these phases, then young carers and young adult carers will lose significant amounts of time through childhood into adulthood, into paid employment. Next slide, please. The final study I want to point out is called the Me-We study. And this is a study that we have just completed. And it's about the mental health of young adolescent carers across Europe. And we're talking now about 15, 16, and 17-year-olds. So I'm again now focusing at the older age group of young carers to show you some of the outcomes of caring on these young people in 6 countries: Sweden, the Netherlands, Italy, Slovenia, Switzerland, and the United Kingdom. Next slide, please. All of these countries were chosen because they represent different levels of awareness and policy responses to young carers in those countries. And I won't go into detail about this, but if anyone wants more detail, they can always email me. My email will be on the last slide. But effectively, different countries have different levels of awareness and policy responses, including legislation. And these 6 countries represent different layers, different levels of awareness, with the UK being the most aware because we have specific legal rights for young carers and 30 years of research, whereas other countries are only just emerging now. Next slide, please. So of this, on this survey, the Me-We study, we had 9,500 participants who filled in an online survey. And this online survey included the MACA, the Multidimensional Assessment of Caring Activities, the PANOC, the Positive and Negative Outcomes of Caring, and a number of other psychometric instruments, which allows us to look at young carers aged 15 to 17 and their adaptation to caring, but also the outcomes. Now, of those 9,500 participants, some were not in the right age group. But so when you take those out, you've got 7,000 aged 15 to 17, of which 2,099 were actually adolescent young carers of the correct age. So we can compare the 2,099 adolescent young carers with the 5,000 other people, adolescents who filled in this questionnaire, who weren't carers, but who still told us about their health and well-being, about their aspirations, about their experiences. And we can make a direct comparison between adolescent young carers and adolescents who are not caring. We can see that the person who receives care is predominantly family members, mothers, fathers, grandparents, siblings. We can see that 16% of our sample of 2,099 adolescent young carers were caring for more than one family member. And indeed, 53% were caring for a close friend, and 22% were caring for families and friends. This is the first study in which we really could see that young adolescent carers were not just caring for families with illness, disability, mental health problems, cognitive addiction problems, but many were also caring for friends, and in particular, friends who have a mental health problem. And you can see on the family's health conditions that physical disabilities counted for almost half of the conditions, mental illness 40%, cognitive impairments, and then addiction of the family's health conditions. But for friends, it was predominantly mental illness. Next slide, please. The general findings from this study show that the more caring someone does, the higher the levels of caring, as measured by the MACA, the multidimensional assessment of caring activities instrument that we designed, higher levels of caring are clearly associated with greater school difficulties, greater amounts of bullying, and greater, poorer mental health of the adolescent young carers. So there is a clear correlation, which you can all cite, between the higher levels of caring and direct outcomes in terms of school difficulties and greater levels of poor mental health. We also found out that females were doing more caring in all countries, but specifically, particularly in the Netherlands and the UK. Again, positive and negative adaptation is found, but again, critically, adolescent young carers have a lower state of well-being as measured by an instrument called KidScreen than non-carers. Critically important. If people say to you, how do you know that adolescent young carers have a poorer state of well-being than other children selected at random? The evidence is clear that adolescent young carers do have a lower state of well-being as measured by a well-respected, internationally used psychometric instrument called KidScreen than non-carers. And females have the lowest well-being. Female adolescent young carers have the lowest well-being. You can see on the impacts column that the adolescent young carers are telling us about their own mental health difficulties, their school performance, they're reported being bullied, and the ranges differ from countries. So the country ranges for mental health is from 12 to 57%, for school performance being negatively affected from 9 to 38%. And the big bold figure at the start of each of those is the average across all 6 countries. But what most people didn't recognize till we did this piece of work was that 14% of these adolescents were saying that they had thought about hurting themselves. And again, the range is from 7 to 28%, depending on which of those 6 countries you're in. And 6% said that they had thought about hurting others, including the person that they cared for. And the range was from 3 to 12%, depending on which country. This is the first study, we think, in which we clearly can see an association between caregiving with a large sample of 2,099 adolescent young carers and thoughts about deliberate self-harm or harm to others. These children and young people didn't necessarily go on to hurt themselves or to harm others, but they certainly had thought about that. And that indicates a level of distress which we were surprised by, even though this was a study of the mental health of adolescent young carers. Next slide, please. And what you can see here is the levels of difficulties across the 6 countries. And I'm not going to go into detail here, but you can see the negative effect on school performance. The average is 17%. The experience of bullying, the average is 14.8%, right through to the final column, considering hurting others, which is the average is 6%. And you can see the difference in each country. It must be reported, though, that in the United Kingdom, which is the red line, you can see that the red line is almost the largest, the longest for each of those items. So for each of those items, it appears that young people, adolescent young carers in the UK, fare worse than young adolescent carers in all the other countries. And this reflects a number of things. Firstly, that our sample is recruited from young carers projects, not from at random from schools, which is how most other countries recruited. And of course, being in a young carers project, you've already gone through a process of eligibility, etc. So we were working, we think, with the most young carers in need, but also because there are higher levels of mental health amongst young people in the UK than in any other country. Next slide, please. So finally, the last 2 slides identify some of the ways forward. We obviously need to understand young carers' family dynamics and how children's roles are affected because of those illnesses and conditions. We can see that, as I've said, young carers, families expect more as they grow older. There are multiple sites of transition where children are especially vulnerable and where interventions, including service and support, could be especially timely and beneficial. If you think about those 15, 16 and 17-year-olds in the Me We project, reporting being bullied at school, reporting mental health problems, reporting the thoughts of deliberate self-harm or harm to others, we have to think about how those experiences and negative outcomes will affect their transition now that they're 15, 16 and 17 into adulthood. We need to think through what all of those data mean for a person who's thinking about self-harm, a person with mental health problems, and how that's going to affect access to college, university, and paid work. And how do we intervene to ensure that as many adolescent young carers can actually compete on an equal playing field with non-young carers and other young people? So professionals need better knowledge and understanding of these key transition points and children's particular vulnerabilities during those phases and how they can be supported. And of course, assessments are critical to identifying those transition needs and the support that will help them. My final slide, please. So in summary, this analysis is important, but action is critical. The key thing that's needed is translating those research findings into practical, thoughtful ways to intervene at particular phases in a young carer's transition, from very young children as shown in the census figures, right through to those who are 16, 17, and those who are hoping to access and get into the paid labour market. We can prevent caring roles becoming institutionalised if we intervene very early for the youngest carers, but we also need to intervene throughout this period, throughout this life cycle of caring, to ensure that young adult carers have the best access to the labour market and to higher education and further education so that they can thrive as children and as adults. Final slide, please. And those are my contact details if you want to contact me. For some of you, you know I move around, and I'm now literally starting today at Manchester Metropolitan University. So I'll be on the 6-hour drive to Manchester as soon as we finish this session today. Thank you very much indeed for the opportunity to talk to you about this study. Andy, back to you.
Thank you, Saul. Thanks ever so much, as always, for your insight and also your passion for young carers, and particularly on a day when you've got such a long drive ahead from that perspective. I think for me, you really highlighted that family dynamics and that real need for that whole family approach. I think what you said really chimed with me in terms of what one young adult carer said, in terms of, for her, one of the biggest things was the guilt, thinking actually, A, how will mum cope, but also, is my younger sister just going to have to pick up everything that I've been doing and the impact on me for the last 3-4 years? Is she now going to be in exactly the same situation? So I think there's so much to be done around that sort of that whole family approach, but also the impact of not getting the support in place for other family members, whether it's a person who they're caring for, or for example, if they're a sibling young carer and there's a parent carer not getting supported. I think you've really summarised that really neatly. So thank you, Saul. We'll go on to the next slide and the next speaker. So we're now going to hand over to Dr. Kate Blake-Holmes from the University of East Anglia. So she's been specialising in sort of mental health social work for the past 17 years and has done a lot of research around young carers and parental mental health in particular. As I mentioned, all of the speakers' bios are in the joining instruction, so she's got more information. Without further ado, I'll hand over to Kate.
Thank you ever so much, Andy. Can I just check, can everybody hear me okay?
Going in and out a little bit, Kate, but...
Hang on, sorry, I don't know why my laptop decides to do this time. Let me put on...
The joys of technology. You can guarantee if you don't have them in, it won't work. If you do have them in, it would have worked anyway from that sense. So.
Brilliant. Can you hear me better now?
Much better. Thanks, Kate.
Fantastic. That's fine. I always try and avoid wearing these microphones, but that's grand. Okay, well, thank you, and sorry for that. So thank you ever so much to Axel and to Saul for taking the time, and those amazing. It was brilliant to kind of hear Axel talking and doing so well at university, but just those struggles that are constantly going on, that constant sort of mindfulness that you have to keep. It was really powerful to hear that firsthand, and for Saul to amazing to hear kind of data coming from such a massive data set and an international study. That's great. So the study that I wanted to talk about today focuses right back down to a much smaller study and looking at qualitative data. So rather than kind of numbers and the statistics of it, but looking at what I'd looked at within my study was looking at specific individual experiences. And within the study that I'm going to be talking about today, I'd focused on individuals that had grown up with parents with parental mental illness. So I'm going to be just talking about experiences around parental mental illness. And the reason that I use within this presentation and within my study the terminology of mental illness rather than mental ill health or mental well-being is because that's what the participants said that they felt most comfortable with. And also when I was talking to them, I was talking about parents who had a level of mental ill health that meant that they were in receipt of care and support from secondary mental health services. So that would be adults who may be needing to spend periods of time within psychiatric hospital, or parents who were receiving support through community mental health teams or specialist psychiatric teams. So not necessarily individuals that were receiving support from their mental health from their GP or primary care services, but people who were seen to be and diagnosed to be having what is called, in a very medically modelled way, severe and enduring mental illness. So diagnoses such as bipolar disorder or schizophrenia, personality disorder, that needed a higher level of care, just to make that kind of really clear. And I've always been really interested in this group of young people and these families from my experience as a mental health social worker. And I think although we know that, as Saul said, proportionately, they are a high proportion of our young carers, I think often young carers who are caring for a parent with mental illness are often very hidden. And that can be because the care that they provide is less visible. It's not easy to quantify. There is also, unfortunately, still stigma and fear around service intervention. So often people might hide what they're doing, or families might be fearful about saying about what's happening within the family and the care that's required. And also, especially within the UK, our services are still very fragmented. So we have children and adult services, and we have social care and health services. And in the middle, that's where these children kind of fall through the gaps. Could I have the next slide, please, Belinda? That's great. So just to let you know, the study that I did was in 2018, and I spoke to 20 people across the UK and asked them to recall their experiences and their understanding of their parents' mental illness throughout their life course. So what was it like to grow up with a parent and mental illness, and how did they make sense of that illness for themselves? Now, I always feel the need when I'm talking about this study to make a huge caveat, because within qualitative research, we're looking for rich experiential data. We're looking at understanding those experiences. But I know that the experiences that the participants very kindly gave to me aren't representative of everybody. I can't generalize this experience. I can't say that this is what everybody would feel, because it's not the case. No two people experience these things in different way, in the same way. So when we're thinking about this level of sensitivity with the research, we have to know that all of the stories are very personal and they're very subjective. Not all parents with a mental illness will struggle with their parenting or their family life as a result of their mental illness at all. Similarly, not all young carers who are caring for a parent with mental illness will feel that it impacts in their life as significantly as a lot of these participants said. However, it was true for them. And we do know that mental ill health can cause challenges for other areas of your life, such as parenting. And we know that being a parent can cause stress and anxiety that can impact on your mental health. So I think it's really important to consider these needs. I'm also very aware that within this study, although I sought to speak to people about a range of different experiences, actually the majority of people that came to me and were interviewed by me and spoke to me, usually for about 3 hours at a time, came with stories of unresolved trauma, of experiences that were very, very difficult for them. And I think that's something about, as humans, we're motivated to tell those stories. They were people that came to me that felt that they hadn't been heard before, they hadn't been listened to before. So I just always feel like I need to caveat that, because I'm always very aware of this concept of dangerous knowledge, and I don't want the findings of this study to exacerbate or influence kind of further negative stereotypes around mental illness or parental mental illness. However, I think it's really important for us to see the level of needs that could be within these families and recognize that and step in and be able to kind of help with those needs in a proactive and non-judgmental way. Next slide, please. So thinking about, I obviously within my study, I looked at the whole life course, but there were real interesting findings that came out around transitions to adulthood. And as Saul said, the transitions to adulthood and transitions throughout childhood are incredibly important. And there are, within our transition to adulthood, there is a point of need for independence and autonomy. This is where we're making really significant life decisions. But often for young adult carers, making those transitions, they're making them within a sense of bounded agency. So their agency isn't just about personal expression of choice of what they want to do, but they have to make choices within a range of constraints. And that can be about their family composition, their obligations within the family, expectations. It could be about the illness or the needs, the care needs that they're responding to. It's often very much down to the services that are there, that's available for themselves and their family. That service provision has a massive influence on what choices young adult carers can make. And there's also societal constraints as well, whether that's gender or ethnicity or class as well. So we always need to be aware that a lot of the decisions that these young adult carers are made are constrained and are bounded a lot of the time. This can also be influenced by the different types of care that people provide. So the people that I was speaking to provided lots of instrumental care, so practical care, shopping, managing medication, looking at household bills, but they also provided a lot of emotional care, keeping people safe, responding to crisis, checking in, making sure, looking at anxiety levels, watching out for relapse signatures. And it was that emotional care that took an awful lot of the kind of psychological space and the emotional kind of labor that those young adult carers had to carry. And within their 2017 study, McCormick et al. Talked about the fact that for some young carers, they can develop this kind of this role of the caretaker child. So they develop intuitive behaviors that are designed to anticipate and meet the needs of others. And it's this kind of sense of self that then carried through while they were making those decisions around their transitions to adulthood. And I think as services, that's something that we have to be really aware of. So as a mental health service social worker for many years, I have heard lots of people talk about young carers in very positive ways, but also sometimes in a very easy way of saying, oh, they're so amazing, they're so resilient, they know what they're doing, they're so brilliant at this, they're managing it so much better than I could ever do. And that is fantastic. But I think sometimes we misinterpret this demonstration of resilience and competence, and we forget that what we're talking about is a child or is a young person. And actually that child or that young person may well have developed these skills and this demonstration as a way of masking the fact that they're exhausted and that emotionally they're finding it difficult to think about their own needs. So while I think we need to celebrate the competence and the resilience of young carers as services, as health and social care services, we also need to look at what that's underpinning and how well that's serving the young carer themselves. And as Saul quite rightly said, caring doesn't end at 18. So young adult carers, it's so important to continue thinking about those needs and into adulthood as well. So within my study, I just want to talk about 5 key areas that came out. If you could change the slide, please. That's great. So the first area, which again really reflects the areas that Saul was talking about, a lot of the people I spoke to talked about the impact that it had upon their education and employment. That it had a massive impact on their ability to engage. They were tired during their day, they were distracted, they missed days, that they were worried, all of these kind of impacts that we're very aware of and that we know happens. And they also talked about the fact that they needed to adjust their choices. So they needed to choose colleges that were nearby, as Axel said, about wanting to kind of move away, but also being very mindful about needing to be close. They weren't able to just choose whichever they wanted. They had to kind of be mindful of those constraints while they were making their choices. Or I spoke to people that were in the workforce, but they were talking about the fact that they had to work certain shifts. So they would get particular jobs so they could work on the weekends, or night shifts so they could make sure that somebody was at home all of the time. And there was also a really big thing around the practicalities of balancing their caring roles, what they could take on for themselves in terms of their education and work alongside their caring roles, and also the emotional tension and their sense of duty. So 4 of the people that I spoke to talked about the fact that at points of particular pressure for them, so example, exam times at school for GCSEs or at A levels, would then cause real concern and anxiety in their parents, because their parents wanted the best for them, but the anxiety that it caused their parents could then result in a relapse of their parents' mental illness. So they talked about the fact of constantly having to carry a fine balance of how much they could push themselves and what impact that would have upon their parents. So they talked about not wanting to push themselves forward all the time because they felt that might unsettle their parents, or that if they push themselves too far forward, that they wouldn't then be able to respond if a crisis came. So they felt that they were constantly needing to hold a portion of themselves back. And they talked about the fact that their parents didn't want that for them. Their parents weren't wanting to hold them back, but were also really frightened about what that would mean for the dynamic within the relationship and for the care that they absolutely needed. Next slide, please. This also had a massive impact on their relationships with partners. So for 6 of the young adult carers that I spoke to who were still living with their parents, they weren't in relationships. They talked about wanting to have relationships and build relationships, but they felt that they didn't have the time and space within their lives to dedicate to building a relationship, to being able to move outside of that caring role and kind of meet people and develop relationships for themselves. For those that were in relationships, 3 of the participants talked about having a really tricky time trying to balance the competing needs. So trying to balance the needs of their new relationships and trying to have their partners understand their caring role, and especially around the emotional caring, the checking in, the worrying, the keeping touch that they felt that they needed to do. And they talked about the fact that their partners didn't recognize this, and it was really, really difficult for them to balance. And they also talked about not wanting to repeat patterns. So that was about not wanting to repeat patterns themselves that they'd seen within their childhood, either negatively. And Emily here talked about wanting to write a prenup in case she kind of found herself in a relationship that she'd seen between her mum and dad. But also 4 of the young people that I spoke to talked about the fact that they had noticed that in previous relationships that they'd got into, they were getting into relationships where they were needing to provide a lot of care and support for the person that they were in a relationship with. And that wasn't necessarily what they wanted, but they felt that they were drawn to these relationships where they had to step into this caring role because that's what they knew to do. That's where they felt comfortable, and that's where they felt that they had sort of skills. Next slide, please. They also talked about the difficulties in thinking about becoming a parent, and this was something that was quite kind of astounding within the project. So it wasn't about, there are some bits within the literature about the fact that people might be worried about becoming parents because of the genetic inheritability of mental illness, but that didn't come out at all within this project. A lot of the things that people talked about was the fact that they didn't feel emotionally equipped to be able to become a parent. They didn't know how to parent healthily because they didn't feel that they'd had that experience themselves. But they also, for most of the participants, they talked about the fact of how do I care for both people? How do I become a parent and have a child that I need to care for while I'm still caring for my parent, while I'm still providing a high level of care? How do I actively manage the relationship between my child and my parent? And they talked about the fact that it made them really shift their perceptions in terms of the way that they wanted to parent, but also the way that they reflected on their own childhood. Next slide, please. So when they were thinking about all of these things, they talked about how they would exercise their agency, and they felt that it really impacted on the way that they could exercise their own agency. It impacted on the way that they engaged with people outside of the room of their caring, and the way that it affected their sense of self, and they thought that they were viewed by others. They felt that they were always waiting for an interruption, for a relapse, for something to happen, and that they had to focus on the parent more than themselves. So they often felt that their own identity was inextricably linked to their parents' mental health as a carer. And as Saul had said, oh no, I think Andy, sorry, had said about they'd worried about the fact that when I move on, is this going to then get passed to my siblings, and what am I leaving? How do I leave? Next slide, please. And finally, they talked about creating and maintaining boundaries and how important that was to be able to build diverse strategies to maintain boundaries, to build that physical distance, to gain access to professional support, whether it's counselling, but also, and it was really interesting because that came up in Saul's case as well, they talked about, for many of the participants, they talked about choosing to go into career in mental health care because they felt that that gave them a way to understand the care that they'd provided, and it gave them a way to make those boundaries and create that kind of distance. And also one participant talked about the fact that they went into mental health nursing because they felt that over their childhood they had developed a Swiss Army knife of tools to allow them to care. So what we found was when these people were talking about the boundaries, the people that were managing the best were the people that had been supported through their parents and through services like young carer services and health and social care services to build a flexible boundary. So rather than being enmeshed into all I can do is care or I cannot care at all, they actually were able to develop a boundary where they could be flexible, where they could respond at points of needs, but then step away at other points and focus on themselves. So to kind of finish off, what we need to be doing is working with these young people and working with the families to help negotiate those boundaries and look at how service can step in and allow these young people to take more space for themselves. I'm aware that I'm running out of time, so I'm going to end there with the last slide, please, Belinda. And if anybody wants to read up more about this, there's some links here to some articles that I've written about this study that would give you more details. Okay, thank you.
Brilliant. Thanks ever so much, Kate. I appreciate a lot of really great content to get through in a short space of time. I think for me, the point that really stuck out was the point which echoes what Saul said about caring not stopping at 18. So I think that's where it's so vital that adult services are looking at actually what does our commissioned adult carer support look like? Does it meet the needs of young adult carers? A lot of adult carers support, carers assessment is about maintaining that carer in their caring role. is that right? Is that the appropriate lens to be looking at it when you've got a young adult carer trying to get into work for the first time, trying to get into university, trying to continue their apprenticeship from that perspective? And also what you said about holding back. I know I was speaking to a young person recently who's just started at Oxford, saying actually for her it was that guilt about saying actually she wants to have an amazing time, but is wondering actually if I have an amazing time, but I know mum's really struggling, will I feel guilty about that? Or actually I don't want to be ringing all the time, but actually then again I feel guilty. Lots of that emotional impact as to making that transition and settling in, making friends even more sort of challenging from that perspective. So thank you ever so much from that sense. So we've heard from Saul, Kate, and of course Axel, hearing about what are some of the issues coming up in terms of from that young adult carer perspective. But what we're really keen to do is actually look at some of the work being done to try and tackle this. We've heard a lot about in terms of universities and the role they've got to play within this. So I'm delighted, and go to the next slide, please, Belinda, to be able to invite welcome Paul Traynor, who's the Head of External Affairs from Carers Trust Scotland. So Paul's worked in the Scottish voluntary sector since 2008 in a wide range of participation, policy, campaign and research related roles. And he's been leading the work at Carers Trust Scotland around their policy and external affairs work, and including the policy work of the Scottish Young Carers Services Alliance. And the reason I was so keen to get Paul here and Carers Trust Scotland here today is they've been doing a lot of work specifically with universities across Scotland to try and improve that identification, but also the support for students with caring responsibilities when they go to university. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Paul.
Thanks, Andy. And I do apologise. I do have a lot of slides, but I will be going through them very quickly because I'm aware of time. Next slide, please. So firstly, I was just going to talk about the research which we undertook in Scotland around to try and expand our knowledge base of student carers in Scotland to help us create the platform where which we've used to influence policy. The aspect of our research aim was to think of the lived experience of student carers in Scotland and go into a bit of a deep dive into that to really explore some of that in more detail, and then to come up with recommendations and consider those policy changes. Next slide, please. We looked at a range of participants, and really interesting as part of the study, which was the underpinning of our work in Scotland, was we looked at prospective and current student carers, but we also looked at carer support workers and those working in carer centres, and as well we also spoke to college and university staff, predominantly student support staff, and widening participation and access staff as part of our building of this work. Through that, we looked at a range of methods. We used surveys, one-to-one interviews, group interviews, and drop-in events. And across all methods, we engaged with 391 people throughout the process. So next slide, please. So one of the the main key themes that came out of that was the application process can be a challenge for student carers with caring responsibilities. Next slide. And from that, we had 137 respondents. Half said that they gave their caring role a great amount of thought when they were applying for college or university. And interestingly, around 72% of care support workers were worried about, said that carers were worried about the person they cared for during the application stage for college and university. So it was really interesting. Part of that study was looking at actually what are the considerations that student carers have even before making that transition to college or university. Next slide, please. One of the other themes that really came out was the location of the college or university. How far away were they from home? How long would it take for them to get back? And you see there's some quotes there, and there's some quotes throughout the presentation, which I won't read out, but people can read it at their leisure. The next slide, please. Another key theme that came out through the work that we were doing was that concept of whether they were able to move out, whether they were going to go to college or university and live at home and travel to and from college or university, or be able to move over and move out of the house to look at that. So there was one of those where some key considerations that came up through the study and through the conversations with student carers and prospective student carers. Next slide. The other aspect was around disclosure. How do you tell your college or university that you're a student carer? How do you do that within a very usually short application form. How do you inform them through the UCAS process that you have that you're a student carer at that precise time? You know, the ability to select and self-select as a student carer isn't on the application form at the time we did the research, although individual disclosure is now moving forward, particularly around matriculation. But for some student carers, there was what came out quite strongly in the study was some were very happy to phone up and inform the college or university that they're a student carer, but many were not sure how do you actually disclose your caring responsibilities in relation to that. Next slide, please. From the survey, 77% of surveyed student carers thought that being a student carer is more challenging than for students without caring responsibilities. Now that's really interesting as well, because that's their own self reflection on that. The next slide. And some of those challenges that they thought came out through the study was time as a challenge for student carers. So some of those contexts have actually been able to attend class, to socialise and to study, and Saul highlighted a lot of this earlier on through his research as well. The next slide. Attending class, some of the voice of student care, sometimes it's difficult for a student to always attend classes due to having responsibilities for someone else. So there's this was one of the key themes that came out was actually being able to attend and sustain at college or university being that challenge. Next slide. Again, the student carer highlighting you don't get the opportunity to do the studying you need to do. That time aspect being a theme that came out from that. And the next slide. Again, one of the key aspects that came out throughout the study was around young student carers having access to socialise and to spend time with their peers. And that came out quite strongly that many student carers felt they missed out in the experience of student life due to their caring responsibility. Next slide. Again, and I think Saul highlights this as well around how is your education being affected throughout university, and that was echoed through this study as well. Next slide. Finances, and this was something came out quite strongly, although it wasn't a focal point of this particular study, but came out quite a lot through the voices and the lived experience of student carers was actually around the financial difficulty of being at college or university and the additional costs, as well as the inability to work or not having the same flexibility to work and study and care. And that came out quite strongly, and for many, even within some of the conversations which we had with student carers, was often one of the main factors of why they may consider dropping out of college or university was the financial barriers and the lack of support that they had received. Next slide. And again, that balancing act was one of the key aspects there. But one of the interesting parts of the studies, we also asked really those staff that were supporting colleges and students at college and university, their view and some of their insight in relation to that. So next slide, please. And the next one again, thanks. And so one of the things that they highlighted was the difficulties that college and university staff had was knowing who student carers were. How do we identify them? And that was one of the issues that came up quite a lot. And there was a lot of discussion around, if we don't know through application, what mechanisms can we put in place to look at that? And it's one of the aspects, many colleges and universities now have that within enrolment processes at college and university. That only helps at the sense of when someone's already at the college or university. At the point of application, that still remains a barrier and came across through that. Next slide. Having an all-staff approach, one of the aspects was it was really difficult to have a whole institution approach, because very much student support staff reported that they were seen as the lead for student support, and it was difficult to get the entire staff team sometimes involved. But in some institutions, what was found through the work was there was a process of ensuring that a whole institution approach could take place to support student carers. And the next slide. Again, sometimes what college and university staff highlighted as one of the main aspects for people identifying themselves or coming forward for support is financial support. But actually there is limited financial support which is specific to student carers. There isn't the same level of discretionary funding as there is for other groups, and that can sometimes be a barrier for student carers coming forward to identify themselves. So next slide. So some of the recommendations and suggestions which came out of this study was multiple disclosure opportunities. So looking at how do student carers disclose or be able to identify themselves, visible, proactive and flexible support. So looking at the support that's provided for student carers, looking at the support plans and a name contact at all institutions for student carers and having that a clear contact on websites, and providing training for all staff, financial support for student carers at a national level. And because this report was focused in a Scotland context, it was prioritising carers in a Scottish Government policy process and looking at widening access aspects as well, and creating those strong links with working with carers organisations as well. And off the back of this, we developed a national award for colleges and universities called Going Further and Going Higher for Student Carers Awards. And we built in within the process an award basis for colleges and universities to go through a process to be awarded for their good practice for developing student carer specific policies, for looking at training, for looking at how they identify student carers, for looking at contextualised admissions within colleges and universities, and looking at the wider support that they provide. And if they meet a certain level of that criteria, they would achieve the award. And I'm happy to talk about the award later as well. And next slide, sorry, I am aware of time. So the full report that I've just spoke about is available on this link. And I know the slides will be available afterwards. And I'm happy to talk about our Going Further and Going Higher award separately as well, if anybody wants to reach out to me to discuss that. And I think this might be my final slide. This was really, there's also a poster available with some of the key data facts from that research, which is available for download there. And I think the last slide just has my email address on it, if anyone wants to get in touch.
Brilliant. Thanks ever so much, Paul. And I think what's been done up in Scotland really does show actually just the range of things that can happen. I think it'd be really great to hear a bit more when we get to the discussion later about the sort of the award schemes. I think that's one we're getting, as you said, that whole institution approach, because it's great having student support on board, but actually if you're a young carer who's had to rush home because mum's been taken into hospital and you can't get to lectures, if your lecturer refuses to record their lectures, then actually you're going to be struggling and you're going to be behind your peers. So the work that's been done really does show just a flavour of actually what we may want to look to try and replicate in other areas. Because I think there's been a lot of focus, lots of really brilliant focus on young carers in schools and in secondary education and primary over the past sort of decade or so. But I think it's really been highlighted that need to get that consistency as people move up through the educational journey as well. Brilliant. Thank you ever so much to all our speakers so far. We are going to, if I go to the next slide, Belinda, and take a comfort break. So if you've got any questions for any of the speakers so far, please do put them in the chat so far. I've committed to a 10-minute comfort break in the agenda, and so I'll be sticking to a 10-minute comfort break from that perspective. We've got some time which we can make up later on in the agenda I've already built in. So if I can ask people to come back, we'll be starting at 2:23. Feel free to go grab a drink, stretch your legs, and I look forward to seeing people in 10 minutes. Okay, we're going to start back up. Hopefully everyone's had a chance to grab a drink, stretch their legs. Hopefully people, just checking we stop sharing the screen just to give people a bit of a break from seeing it. Can I just check that everyone can see the slides okay from that perspective? Brilliant. So we're going to take a bit of shift now and move from a focus on young adult carers transitions to focusing on transitions that Saul mentioned earlier about those much younger ones. So looking at actually that primary to secondary transitions as well. So I'm delighted to have a few different organisations going to be talking about some of the work they've been doing in their local area. So we're going to be starting by hearing from Belinda Jones, who's part of my team at Caring Together, and also going to be hearing from Alice Stevenson at the Benjamin Foundation. And then we're going to be following that by hearing from Charlotte Baker, who's the Senior Young Carers Project Worker at Centre 33. Because we've got 3 different organisations and 3 different speakers, I just ask you all to have a look at the joining instructions, and you can have a look at their biographies to see all of their backgrounds. We've got a range of experience and some really great work being done as well. But without further ado, I'll hand over to Belinda and to Alice.
Thank you, Andy. So as Andy already introduced, I'm a part of the Awareness and Voice team in Caring Together, and also a team leader. So we do awareness raising work for young carers across Cambridgeshire, Peterborough and Norfolk. And me and my team here in Norfolk lead on the awareness raising work for young carers. So it's commissioned by Norfolk County Council and led by Carers Matter Norfolk. And in Norfolk, we deliver a whole range of young carer awareness raising activities. So with healthcare settings and obviously predominantly educational settings. So that can be anything from staff awareness sessions through to PSHE lessons to assemblies. And we do that right from the earliest, from the EYFS and Key Stage 1, right through to secondary and further education. But the EYFS and the Key Stage 1, I think, is a really key one. Obviously, Saul talked a lot earlier about really making sure we identify those young carers at the earliest opportunity to, 1, let them know that they're a young carer, and 2, that support, that vital support is available should they ever need to access it. So here in Norfolk, we work in partnership with some fantastic young carer organisations, and I'm joined today by one of them to talk about a young carers transition pilot we co-produced and delivered together last year. Alice?
Hi, I'm Alice. I work for the Benjamin Foundation based in Norfolk. We have 2 young carer services. We have our Boom Young Carers. The name was made up by some of our young carers. We run groups for young carers from age 8 right through to 18. And alongside that, we are also deliver on the commission service led by Carers Matter Norfolk, providing service for young carers, one-to-one support, monthly group support. And the aim for that is to reduce excessive or inappropriate caring. So Andy's invited me along today to talk fairly briefly about an event we did last summer. Sorry.
Next slide.
Next slide, sorry. Oh, Belinda, I thought you were doing the slides. Brilliant. So we did an event last July. We were just emerging from the COVID pandemic at this point, and school had been a big issue for a lot of our young carers. As I'm sure many of you who work with young carers also found, attending school was a lot lower than it had been previously, and getting back into school after that pandemic had been a stressful period for many of them. And we identified that there was a bit of a gap in support for the transition from primary school moving up into secondary school. And of course, this is a transition that all young people make when they reach year 6. But we know, working with young carers, that there's those additional stresses in their lives. So we wanted to do an event for the young carers we worked with in year 6 to make that a bit of a smoother transition. So we spoke to Belinda. They do a lot of work with schools, as she's said in her introduction. So we knew they had many contacts within the secondary schools as well as primary schools. We looked at our list of young carers, identified those that were in year 6 and contacted them asking which high schools they would be going up to. We then looked at the young carers we worked with already in secondary school and selected those that were already attending the secondary schools that our year 6 young carers were going to be going up to. And we invited them along to a group session. We got them together. Young carers are obviously the experts. They're the ones who are in school, they're living it on a day-to-day basis. They know exactly what issues they may be facing. So we got all these young carers together, those in year 6 and those who are going, who are already in the secondary schools they were going up to. And we got them together for a session. They were able to break into groups of the schools that they would be going to, so they could meet other young carers who are already in that school, and also other young carers who may be moving from a different primary school to them, but will be meeting at the same secondary school when moving into year 7. I think having those familiar faces makes a big difference when you're going into new environments. They were able to ask the existing pupils questions about the schools. They were able to find out the names of the staff that had been helpful for them. We are planning on doing this session again this year. We're just in the process of planning that for next month. And one of the things we noticed we'd missed last year was getting the staff on board from the secondary schools. So this year we are going to be making an effort to contact the schools, identifying the pastoral workers, any young carer champion staffs they may have, and staffs within senior leadership team as well, and inviting them to come along. Of course, the young carers, we know that schools do transition events within schools, so year 6 pupils often go and visit the high schools for a day and live a day in the life of secondary school. But we were very much focusing on the pastoral support and the support that can be put in place specifically for young carers. I'm now going to hand over to Belinda, who can talk a bit about the work she does in the high schools, which is going to be fabulous for the connections in inviting those staff along to our event. Belinda.
Thank you, Alice. So here in Norfolk, well, Cambridgeshire, Peterborough, Norfolk, but mostly in Norfolk, we have our carer-friendly TIC education, which was born from our Norfolk Young Carers Forum, which is Parliament, a committee, if you like, of young carers who meet to discuss the issues and impacts of being a young carer and really ensuring that the voice of young carers is heard in things that are implemented across the county. And one of the things that they told us a few years ago was actually the one place we don't feel really understood or supported is at school. And so they came up with 5 not very simple, but very achievable standards that actually if a school were meeting, they would be leaving no stone unturned in the support they can offer to young carers in their setting. And as Alice said, we run this through primary school and secondary school, and it really does encompass transitions. It's a really big part of that. So the event that we did last July, you can see on the top right there, we took along a year 6 transitions assessment tool that we have. We have the template that we'll be happy to share with you. I also believe it's going to be available within the Alliance resources that Andy will be able to share also. And it's a really simple tool that schools can use for that transitioning, you know, one, to make sure that consistency is there from that young carer support from primary to secondary. And one of the key things about it is for young carers, one thing they tell us all of the time is they don't want to have to keep telling that story or their story over and over again. So this is a really fantastic tool that we used within our transitions work last year, and they were able to take that up without having to sit down and verbally go through everything. This is an all about me and my caring role document, which is really useful for it to be passed through. Again, we can share this with any schools that would like to do that as a piece of work with young carers in their setting, and it really does support that smooth transition into secondary school. I'm aware of time, Andy, so that's it from us, but thank you.
Brilliant. Thanks ever so much, Alice. Thank you, Belinda. You've really highlighted, I think, some of the things around the importance of that join up between primary and secondary schools. I know with the school census being changed in the spring to include young carers, this is a really great opportunity to make sure that all schools have got that system in place to know, great, who are our Year 6 young carers? Who are they? What schools are they going to? What information would be useful for the secondary school to know? And also the role that you mentioned, and the key role of a Young Carers Champion. That's something at Caring Together, and I know for others such as the Young Carers National Voice Network have long called for every school to have a Young Carers Champion. And just to flag, if people haven't seen it today, as part of Carers Week, so the Office of the Children's Commissioner for England has got a report coming out next week around sort of attendance at schools. And as part of that, they talk to a number of young carers from across the country. And to mark Carers Week, there's a blog post that's gone out today, which you can see on social media and via the Office of Children's Commissioner's website. I would really suggest people have a look at it, because it really does support some of the sort of the calls that have been made for a number of years in that sense. So following on from Alice and Belinda, I'm really grateful to Charlotte Baker from Centre 33, who to share a bit of their experiences about some of the work they've been doing over a number of years now with Year 6s. So I'll hand over to Charlotte.
Thank you, Andy. Yeah, hi everyone. So I'm Charlotte, I'm part of Centre 33. We're a charity and we support young carers across Cambridgeshire and Peterborough, as well as we have a number of other services within our organisation supporting young people with mental health, well-being, homelessness, sexual health. But obviously today I'm here to focus on the Young Carers Project and specifically, as Andy said, that work between the transition primary to secondary. Next slide, please. So I think a lot of this has already been touched on, and there's probably some similarities in the things that Belinda and Alice have just said as well. So, but hopefully this is still helpful. So we obviously know, as everyone has acknowledged today, this is a really key pivotal transition for young carers. Obviously for any young person it's a big deal, but we know that young carers are balancing so many other things as well at the same time when they're making this transition, moving to a new school setting where there is different academic structures, expectations, changes in social interactions with teachers, peers, and we can see that sometimes young carers can struggle, and that might be evidenced in a number of different ways depending on their situation. It could be around attendance, around increased anxiety and impact on their own well-being, around what they're able to achieve because of the circumstances and the difficulties and all the things they're struggling to balance. Next slide, please. So I guess just that young people are telling us, we've been doing this kind of transitions work with this age group for a long time, and some of the things that we see coming up time and time again is the stress of change, the feeling of isolation or loneliness in that move, feelings around guilt for having to leave the person they care for, and perhaps for longer periods of time with that change in school attendance, of course, leaving that kind of different setting, so the more that nurturing environment of the primary school into something quite new, experiences around finance and money, which can translate into school transport, uniform, equipment for their new school, and just not knowing what support is available in their new setting. I also just want to say on the balance of that, it's obviously we work with lots of young people that when they have the right support in place, they can have a fantastic transition and go on to do absolutely incredible things as well. So I think it's also just important to acknowledge that too, that there are these additional challenges, and that's why this work is so important. But equally, you know, lots of young carers can go on and do fantastic things with the right stuff in place. Next slide, please. So I just before I go into saying a bit about what we do, I just wanted to share the young people that we're currently working with of this kind of cohort, what they're saying, kind of the biggest things on their mind are at the moment. So these are kind of the top 6, if you like. So hearing kind of negative things about the school that you're going up to from your siblings or your peers, it's a worry. Kind of homework, workload pressures, how they're going to manage that, balancing that with caring. As already mentioned, being away from the person they care for, perhaps for longer than usual. It could be a longer bus journey, it could be after school stuff. That's a big change for them. Changes in friends, feelings of loneliness, isolation again, and just that thing of no one knowing about their caring role, having to share that story again, and just not knowing who that person is that they can talk to after being in a school for such a long time, where they know who those people are. Next slide, please. So just to say kind of what we do at Centre 33. So we offer quite a, it is quite an individual approach, bespoke package of support with young people in Year 6, really transitioning up to their new school. It's a blend of one-to-one and group work, which I'll talk a little bit more about. It's quite a long-term piece of work, so we might be starting at the beginning of the year or moving into spring, identifying those young people. But that work continues through till that first term in their new secondary school, where some young people may be settled and that work might end then, but as we know, for lots of young people it might not, and it's quite complex, and they carry on after that. So I'll talk a bit about that as well. The first step really of what we do is to meet with young people who have been identified and referred to us individually, and have a chat about how they're feeling about this move. This will inform really our assessment. So we'll do an assessment with them. It might take one session, it might take a few sessions, depending on what's going on for them. We have a few different tools that we use within this at this point to help us really get a full picture of what their caring role is and how that's impacting them. So one of those tools which Saul Becker actually spoke about earlier is the McGowan and the Pannock. So these tools help us to understand the things that a young person is doing, the actual jobs they do, the practical stuff, the level of care they're providing ultimately, but also how they're impacted by that, whether that be you know, emotionally, socially, and those two tools give us an idea of level of care, impact of care, and where that young person's at that moment. What it also really helps us do at that point is, kind of as mentioned earlier, identifying young people that actually are taking on really high levels of care. These are primary age young people, so young people where perhaps there's a concern that's come out of that assessment, and we might be looking at what else we need to do outside of this piece of transitions work, and as part of it with the family, with other professionals, to build that support package around that young person to reduce the negative impact of that role. So it can help us to, I guess, get an idea of the bigger picture. So that's our first tool we use as part of this assessment. Next page, please. And we also have a tool which we call our My Plan. So we've had this tool for a long time, but more recently it's been kind of developed to really think about how we use it for this age range, and to really capture what we need to around transition and what support young people need. So this forms part of our assessment. I've pulled a couple of pages on here just to give you an idea, because I'm saying assessment, but it is very young person focused, and these tools were all developed with young people. So it's kind of a bigger document than what you can see here, but we can pull out the pieces we want to look at, whether it's well-being, whether it's who's supporting them, whether it's physical health, mental health. So it's a really great tool, and the idea is we work through it with them alongside using the McGowan and Pannock. And at the end of that assessment, we hope we've got a really good idea of what's going on for them. We come away from this with an action plan that's agreed with them and very much led by them. But there is also space within this tool which can pull in family as well. So linking in with mum or dad, or maybe the person they care for, where that's appropriate, to see perhaps what other services also might be helpful to be involved with the family. So it's a real kind of whole family, whole picture thing. And I should have also said, when I was talking about the McGowan and Pannock, we have worked really hard to develop tools for this age range. So we also have a kind of an adaptation of the McGowan and Pannock, which is very visual and really there to make sure that any young person, depending on how they communicate and what works for them, we have something that works. And this is very much done in a way that works for that young person individually. So we might see them in school, we could do it at home, we could do it out in the community, and you know, we're very much led by what works for them ultimately. Next slide, please. So once we've done that assessment, we will then think about the action plan and what do we actually need to do to support this young person. So that can look really different depending on what's going on for them. Often it will be that we've identified through the assessment this young person would like some one-to-one support from us, which we can deliver. That can be emotional support, space to talk about worries, anxieties, but often it's also quite practical. So we can support them with an extra visit to their new school. We can support them to meet the Young Carers Champion in their school, share information with their new school about their caring role. We have at times done things like practice the journey into school if that's been a real worry, making sure they've got everything they need for the start of their school term. So it can be that sort of practical stuff too. And then we also do have a small group work element of that as well. And I think what we've learned and what we've seen and what young people tell us is that that's really powerful. So meeting other young people, going up to your school, we might do those things in groups, for example, if they all want to go and visit together. And that has some really good long-term outcomes in terms of building friendships and building, just having a space where other people get it and are in a similar situation for them. So that's another really important piece of the work. We will then see them in their new school when they start in their new school in September, see how things are going. Of course, for some young people, it's all good, but for others, it's more complex. And really, we're looking to try and set up long-term contact support systems around these young people. So this is the start of this work, but we want to get the Young Carers Champion in place, get other professionals in place outside of school as well, to ensure that this young person can access all the same opportunities in their education as their peers. Next slide, please. And just to say, really, alongside that, we recognise that some young people who are taking on caring responsibilities might not be feeling as worried or might not want that level of support with their transition. As a minimum, we want their new school to know they are a young carer and make sure they know where they need to go if they need that help. Similar to what was being spoken about before, we have resources for schools that schools can use. So we have a Year 6 passport, which is can be completed by the primary school and the young person, or we can be involved in that depending on the situation, that goes across to their new school. And it just means that they can have that starter information highlighting this young person is a young carer, and it gives them the opportunity to say what they want their new school to know about them and their situation. We do a lot of work with schools, so primary schools, secondary schools are a big programme of support which goes alongside this. It can be, we do training, we do bespoke transitions of training and resource, and we also have primary and secondary champion meetings, network meetings that we facilitate. So it brings the schools together and really is about strengthening those networks as well. So we're doing our piece of work, but they're also doing what they need to do to support young people as well. Oh, and yeah, just the final thing is to say that obviously it's all about identifying these young people as well. So some of these young people we might know because we've worked with for a long time. Some might be new, but we know there are lots of young people out there as well that haven't been identified yet. So we do a lot of work to try and raise awareness and increase that identification. And we accept referrals from schools, professionals, parents and guardians as well. I think that's my final slide. I hope that wasn't too quick, but thank you everybody. And yeah, we welcome kind of any connecting up with anyone that wants to talk more about this sort of work. And thank you so much for listening. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thanks ever so much, Charlotte. And I know there's no doubt be a lot of interest in the conversation later, but also after this. I think the way that the tools are being made in a sort of young person accessible way, but also the fact it's become sort of business as usual. So actually it's not just seen as a sort of a one-off piece of work, it's really ingrained into that sort of work for the primary schools, for the secondary schools, but also the commissioned work that you do in Cambridge and Peterborough. So really, really appreciate you taking the time to share your experience as well. We're going to continue in the vein in terms of looking at sort of some practice examples by looking at some of the support around transitions for young adult carers as they approach adulthood. that perspective. So again, I asked people to look at joining instructions, which has got speaker biographies in there, but I'm really delighted to welcome Janice Stiles, who's the Young Carer Lead, but also Chris Martin, who's the Young Carer Support Worker at Carers in Bedfordshire, to share about some of the work they do to support young adult carers transitions. I'll hand over to Janice and Chris.
Thanks, Andy. Hi, everybody. Can I have the next slide, please, Andy? Okay, so as we heard earlier from Professor Becker, the support for young adult carers was very thin on the ground when I first started working with young carers. I originally was working for Spurgeon's Young Carers, and as we said earlier, the support finished at 18 years old. And myself and my colleagues were very worried and concerned about this, as we felt that our young carers wouldn't access the adult services available to them in Bedfordshire. So we approached carers in Bedfordshire at that time, and fortunately they were in agreement with us, and they set up a young adult carer project within Carers in Bedfordshire. And that was in 2007, so quite a long time ago. Unfortunately, due to funding, that has now been taken over by the Young Carer Service. So we now have our Young Carer Service, which includes our Young Adult Carer Service as well, from the up to 25 years old. And obviously, we're doing our transition planning with our young adult carers. I won't go through it all. I think you all know about the Care Act and the reasons why these transitions are done for young people. Can I have the next slide, please? And I'll hand you over to Chris now. I'll explain a bit more about how we actually carry out our transition planning with our young adult carers.
Thanks, Jan. So when young carers reach the age of 16, they'll be contacted by one of our support workers to start the transition planning. This is obviously led by the young carer, so where they want to do it is whether it's over the phone, at home, in school, or whether we go out in the community, to a coffee shop. I've done stuff with young carers in board game cafes. So that it might be over a couple of sessions. And then sort of 6 to 12 months after their initial transition assessment, we will do a review. If the young carer is already registered with us, then we'll review their initial assessment, and that would include the MACA and the PANIC. And if they're a new registration, then we'll look at their carers' will questions and start a transition assessment. We may or may not do the MACA or PANIC unless we feel it's appropriate. So the supports plan is laid out on our database, which is Salesforce. We then send it to the young carer and we monitor and review it. Our assessment covers how they're coping with caring needs, their health and well-being, community inclusion, financial welfare, education, training and employment, independent living, and their life outside of caring. Next slide, please. So this is a case study of one of our young carers, young adult carers now. So Lana cares for her mum, who's got severe mobility issues, and she relies heavily on Lana for support. This has affected Lana's mental health, and she has self-harmed in the past and expressed wishes to end her life. Lana does also have Asperger's syndrome, and that was quite a late diagnosis within the last couple of years. We've supported Lana with the transition by engaging her in groups, and she's attending them, and particularly through lockdown we started online gaming sessions, which Lana was really involved in. She was really keen to carry on the gaming sessions when she went to university in September last year. Not a surprise, she hasn't attended many sessions because of the commitments of university and the social opportunities that she's had. She does still respond to us though, shows interest in the sessions, and I text her quite regularly just to check how she's doing. So we reviewed this just through her activity in our groups, gave her opportunities to talk to us if she needed. She has received counselling with us and has now moved on to adult services, who have recently made a review call. Lana continues to receive support from us because the person that she cares for still lives in Bedfordshire, although Lana is at university in Scotland. This has allowed some continuity for Lana as she obviously goes through massive changes in her life. She's also received a carers grant, and she used this to purchase essentials for her move to Glasgow and decor for her new accommodation. Lana is currently studying psychology, biology, history, and acoustic music at Glasgow University. And although she does still receive several calls a day from her mum, her mum's been referred to the physical disabilities team and her caring role has reduced. She's loving student life and is seeing a massive improvement in her mental health.
Thanks, Chris. Can the next slide, please? Oh, there it is. Thank you, Andy. So another case study of one of our young adult carers. This is Jamal. He's 17 years old and he cares for his brother who has autism and ADHD. He helps his brother to manage his behaviour and often diffuse meltdowns, as well as a practical care he gives to his family as well, and helps his brother with his homework. His mum is also supported by our adult team, which then relieves some of the burden on Jamal for the care responsibilities for his brother. Through the transition, Jamal has been supported by carers in Bedfordshire since 2017 and has had a young carers assessment. He trained as a peer mentor with us, which has seen him become a trusted member of the young carer groups and build strong relationships with other young carers. Jamal was a founding member of the Young Carers National Voice, and along with several other young carers, created the Welcome to My World podcast, which can be found on Spotify. The link is below on the slide. It's also on our website if you want to have a listen to it. He is open and honest. It's open and honest discussion about the experiences of being a young carer. Jamal contributed to the design of our schools award, which has now been awarded to 3 schools in the past year. He was also recognised for his caring role by the High Sheriff of Bedfordshire and was awarded that award last year as well. He's also been represented our young carers on the radio stations and been a voice for our young carers in Bedfordshire. Jamal has received 12 sessions of personalised one-to-one support with us, as he initially struggled to understand and manage his brother's behaviour and conditions. He has been a regular attendee at events and groups, and as seen above, as well as Young Carers Festival, he was an active member of Young Carers groups over the lockdown, including online gaming sessions, all of which have allowed us to keep up to date with Jamal and review his caring role. We've supported Jamal to continue the pursuit of his aspiration to join the RAF, by providing references to gain his sergeant rank and begin supporting future cadets. He also received an emergency COVID grant to support the continuation of his studies throughout lockdown. Where is he now? Jamal is currently completing his A-levels and working hard to reach his goal of becoming a pilot in the Royal Air Force. He is hoping to go to university to complete a degree in engineering and has a number of contingency plans in place for his future. Jamal is incredibly intelligent and hardworking, and we look forward to seeing him and what the future holds for him. Thank you. The next slide, please.
So this is another case study of someone we've been supporting, Tyler, who cares for his mum, who has heart disease, asthma, and mobility issues. Tyler's caring role, again, has been extensive, supporting with medication, cleaning and cooking, pushing her in a wheelchair when they're out, and has attended all of her appointments. Tyler struggles massively with severe anxiety, low self-confidence and self-esteem. We supported him intensively over the last few years with one-to-ones with support worker and wellbeing sessions with our wellbeing worker. We've helped him to make applications to college to study animal care and worked on increasing Tyler's confidence, especially with the use of public transport to get to college. We've been reviewing Tyler again because of his high level of need. It's a regular contact and he receives intensive support from us. We have one-to-one gaming sessions and, as I said earlier, wellbeing sessions as well. He's received a grant for driving lessons and we're hoping this will help with his anxiety around using public transport. Where are they now? Unfortunately, Tyler's mum died suddenly earlier this year, and because of this, he has left college. But we are working with him and local colleges to get him back into education this coming September. We've also had to support him with housing and managing finances, as this was obviously something that his mum dealt with. Not only is Tyler transitioning from young carer services to adult carer services, but he's now facing a huge transition in his life and his role as a carer, having dealt with the loss of his mother. He's still receiving wellbeing sessions, which have moved more onto supporting Tyler with the bereavement of his mum and living independently without his mum's support. Next slide, please.
So as you can see some pictures there of young adult carers. So the activities and funding that supports our transition work. NHS carers grants, which we are able to offer to young adult carers to help them with their education, or as Chris mentioned earlier, transport to get to college or to university. We were able to give emergency COVID grants during the lockdown for our young carers to carry on their education at home. We provided YAC residential for them, where they came along as a group and were able to discuss the issues that they're facing, as well as improving wellbeing and being able to de-stress and feel relaxed. We also obviously take them along to Young Carers Festival whenever we can. We have provided workability workshops where a trainer comes along and helps them with CVs and interview techniques. And as you can see, one of our former yaks there, Dan, he still keeps in touch with us, as do many of them do, because the relationships we've built with them really are life-changing, and they really do like to tell us about how they're getting on and what they're doing. That's it. Any questions, anybody, or wait to the end?
Thank you ever so much, Jan and Chris. We'll have time for questions in the open floor session, so there'll be opportunity for questions for any of our speakers this afternoon. But I think you've both shown just the variety and the breadth of different support that can be provided, but also the difference it makes for those young people. And I think the thing that stood out for all of them is it's tailored to their individual needs. I think that's the key. There will never be a one-size-fits-all, but by having that provision to look at what is it they need? Is it practical support? Is it emotional support? Is it that check-in? Is that a regular trusted person? And I think that goes back to the point I was making earlier about when, for areas where they don't have a young adult carer service, and it goes from young carers to adult carers, is it a cliff edge? Is it a complete different world from what is available up until their 18th birthday, and then what's available after they turn 18? I think that's the area where possibly young adult carers could well fall through the gap. So it'd be really great to explore how is that working in practice, and from a commissioning and also a practice perspective. I'm going to bring in now Andrew Deacon, who's from the Sefton Carers Centre, again to talk about some of the work that they've been doing with young adult carers. So hand over to Andrew.
Thanks, Andy. Hopefully you can hear me okay, everybody. If you can't, someone just let me know. So there's been lots obviously shared already today, and I've been frantically scribbling and changing my notes to try and offer something that's still original at this late stage. So if my thinking seems a bit scattered and my points don't seem to flow that much, it's because I'm trying to really focus on things that maybe haven't been covered. And I think in that respect, I think it's important to start by saying, you know, we've heard a lot today about barriers and about things pertaining to research, to policy and to practice. And our work in Sefton, which is in the Liverpool City region, definitely, you know, fits with all that we've heard today. And though our models in practice might look differently around the country, the kind of ethos underpinning them is certainly, you know, the same, or at least similar across the board, really. So in Sefton, the Young Adult Carers project that I work on began in September 2020, and that brought into Sefton Carers Centre the whole pathway of support really for carers in Sefton. So whether you're 5 or 95, the service is provided in one place by the Carers Centre, and that's really helpful in terms of continuity and also in terms of the kind of knowledge base that the Carers Centre has to support carers of all ages. So obviously my project, which works with 16 to 25-year-olds, will work really closely both with the Adult Carers project for those that transition out at 25, but also with the young carers that are 5 to 15 that then transition up to us. And having that contact is really important to the work we're trying to do. So I think some of the key principles that guide our project are, two of the key principles are, one, that we offer individualized support, personal support for each individual, and two, that all of that work we do is to protect the future of the young carer and to protect their aspirations and their goals. So as I say, we started in September 2020. So it's still a relatively new project, and a project that is learning and developing all the time. One of the key areas that that has become more and more important as we become more established is our partnership work around transitions. So key partners in this for our 16 to 25 age range are the secondary schools, the sixth forms, the colleges, and the universities in and around our local area. These are obviously important to build these relationships on an organisational level, so that the individual young carers that do transition into these different education establishments can get the support, but that it's not done on a one-to-one basis. So that background work, establishing strong relationships with the education providers, has been really important and is now beginning to really bear fruit in terms of real joined up work to increase the chances of young carers not just moving on to further education or higher education, but being successful and getting that kind of individualized support that's been referenced a lot throughout all the different presentations today. Also key to this has been partnership with our local commissioned careers service, particularly for the 16 to 18 cohort, the building that relationship with the careers service and having their own person with responsibility for young carers has been really important, and that's another key partnership that we have with weekly contact around the cohort of young carers, particularly those at risk of becoming NEET or those who are already NEET, because again we try to offer that personalised support, but part of that is realising that we're spread across lots of different areas without particularly being a specialist in any of them. So in terms of things like careers and education, we'll lean on our partners to give that expert advice as well, and work together with them in a joined up way. So partnerships really key, and as in addition to that, the partnership work, like I briefly mentioned, with our young carers 5 to 15 team for those year 10s and 11s who are coming up to our age range, is really important. And in the same way, those 24, 25-year-olds, as they are losing their young adult status and becoming just adults, that communication, that contact, that partnership with our adult carers team in the carers centre is really important for us as well, to ensure that the support that carers have doesn't stop. So another area that's been mentioned a lot and that is a big part of our work is assessment. And after spending a lot of time looking into transition assessments and considering the best practice and recommendations, we spent a lot of time developing a document. And what we found in practice as the service has developed and as we've worked with more and more carers is that document has been sort of absorbed into our wider transition support. So rather than being a document that is filled in at some point and then reviewed at another point and reviewed at another point, the transition assessment or the carers assessment or the young carers assessment, all of that is really ongoing all of the time. And we found that our carers situations are changing so much, and the way the type of care they provide is changing, and the way the caring role makes each individual feel and how it impacts them is changing, that we found that it's been necessary for us to be sort of always on in terms of assessment, and all of our interactions and all of our work with carers assessment is encompassed within all of that. So that means whether we're working with carers closely on a one-to-one basis with an individualized support plan, or whether we're working more at a distance and in the background with regular contact but more light touch support, the nature of the work and assessment as being part of the work is always there, and particularly I think with this age range we're working with. So in terms of, again, the principles underpinning that, talks about the different types of support, the light touch or the more intensive, whatever that may be. We're always focused on goal setting and small steps and taking one step at a time in terms of support. So whereas a transition assessment as the previous presentation or the previous presentations have referred to, that carers assessment might take in well-being, health, leisure, the caring role, education, jobs, finances, independent living, which we're trying to focus on these things actually in reality one step at a time with the carer and one goal at a time, so that we can stay really focused on moving forward. And that is because that's what our carers are telling us they need, and it helps us to build a relationship with them, so that we can focus and work towards improving and improving their life chances and accessing those aspirations, without bringing too much to the table at once. So another point that I've highlighted that is part of the support for some carers is that whole family support, which again it's been referred to throughout the presentation, for that transition to adulthood and the way that the caring role can change and might change, and the impact on the carer and the family and other family members is really important. So maintaining that whole family support has also been something that's become clear to us that it's very important to do. So everything I'm saying there in terms of the way we're offering our support and the way we're providing our support is because we're reacting to the input of our carers and the voice of our carers, and we do have that mixture of reactionary work and proactive work. I think initially when we began the service, we thought it could all be proactive, it could all be idealistic, but as I'm sure everyone who works with young carers knows, it's sometimes not possible to do that, and sometimes you have to be more reactive to situations as they unfold. So in consultation with our carers, we're trying to do what they tell us they need, when they tell us they need it, how they tell us they need it, and that's currently what's working for us at the moment, because what we found, again, as I'm sure everybody knows and finds as well, that a different caring role will affect a different individual in a different way. So trying to group together carers has been problematic. I know this goes back to what Axel was saying at the beginning of the session in terms of trying to listen to carers as individuals and understanding that everyone's situation is different and it affects them in different ways. So again, in response to this kind of thing that Axel said earlier in the session, we're always listening, always learning, and always developing as a service, with the idea that all the barriers that have been discussed throughout the sessions today, we can support carers to overcome them on that individual basis. So there's nothing particularly nothing that I would consider particularly innovative about what we do, but what we do is what our service users are telling us we need, and so that's why the nature of what we do is constantly changing. So that is about everything that I think I didn't scribble out and that I not noted down as we went through. So yeah, thank you.
Brilliant. Thanks ever so much, Andrew. And I think you really highlighted multiple times just the importance of the voice of the young person throughout that, whether it's in terms of what support's being provided, but also in terms of how to sort of shape the support that's on offer as well. I think a couple of other things that really stood out to me was that continuity. That we talked earlier about that continuity between primary and secondary school. How do we ensure that continuity between if they've been involved with a young carer service into then if they still need some support into the adult carers world, rather than saying, oh, well, it's a different organisation commissioned to provide the adult carer support. So you have to start from scratch. You're going to do a carers assessment. You're going to basically have to tell your story over and over again. And I know Simon's put in the chat about what they're doing in Dorset to try and improve that pathway, but I think that's a really key point, as to actually the system should be doing the work rather than the young person, because actually if they're trying to juggle work with caring or with education or with housing or being a young person, relationships, whatever it might be, chances are prioritising contacting a new organisation is probably going to be the bottom of their list from that sense. And I think the final bit that really stood out to me was about partnership. I think we've talked a lot today about partnership work with education. We've talked a lot about joining up between children's and adult services, but also I think the role that health organisations have to play, both within identifying young carers, but then also the support that's on offer as well. We heard earlier from Saul and Kate about the impact on mental health from that perspective. So GPs, mental health services, all got a really key role to play with this age group. So thank you ever so much to Andrew and to our previous speakers, Chris, Jan, Alice, Charlotte and Belinda, for sharing just some of the work they've been doing in practice to try and sort of improve the situation for young adult carers. I'm going to stop sharing my screen now because we're just going to open the sort of floor now to if anyone has got either any questions for any of our speakers. Saul, as he mentioned, has got a 6-hour drive, so he's sadly not been able to stay for this part of the session because he's got a 6-hour drive. But if there are any questions, I can take them back to him. But if anyone's got any questions for any of our speakers, or if they want to share any of their own experiences in their areas, please do feel free to come forward. Otherwise, I might ask a couple of questions as well, but I'll stop sharing as well. Emma.
Thank you, Andy, and thank you so much for the plug of our blog and our upcoming paper as well from the Children's Commission's Office. I really appreciate that. I'm really keen that as part of thinking about attendance, we make sure that the right support is in place. So we're putting together a series of web pages which will support children and schools to support their young carers, including the MACA and other resources. I've just added to the list the Warwickshire ebook that was put in the chat. So it's a sort of question and a request, I suppose. So the question is, what resources do you guys, in your experience, do you think would be really helpful for young carers to have access to? And then if anybody has links or any resources that they use that they think are really valuable, I'd be really grateful if you'd be willing to pass those along. I'll put my email address in the chat. In our blog, we're calling for all schools to implement the MACA as a means of identifying their young carers, and we're calling for all schools to have a young carers champion. So any resources that you guys are aware of that you think would be helpful, I'd be really grateful if you would be happy to share those, and your thoughts as well on what you think schools and other organisations should be doing.
Brilliant. Thanks so much, Emma. Has anyone got any thoughts they want to come in to reply to Emma at all? I see Daniel's put some stuff in the chat for universities in there as well. But has anyone got any sort of reflections that they want to come in? Similarly, if you've got any resources that you're using in practice, please do send them through to Emma and her team when she puts the details in the chat as well from that perspective. I think for me, it's that, and one of the key, often quite boring things is around data sharing. So in terms of between primary school and secondary school, how do we make sure that, great, primary school is really proactive, they know who all their young carers are, there's really good support. How do we make sure that information doesn't slip through the net when it goes through to secondary school as well from that perspective? Has anyone got any thoughts in relation to Emma's questions around attendance, or any sort of general questions or experiences or work you're doing in your local area that you want to come in with at all?
I was just a thought, Emma. I believe that the My Time folk have had to go off to something else. I saw that they were here earlier, so I've put in there that we work with partners in Dorset, but My Time is a charity that's based in the Dorset and Bournemouth, Christchurch and Poole area, so it covers the kind of wider geographical area. And My Time have been doing a lot of work with schools, initially in Bournemouth, Christchurch and Poole, but now branching out into Dorset, where they do a lot of capacity building with schools, so training up their senior leadership team, working directly with young people to encourage them to identify themselves as a young carer, and also working with that pastoral lead about some of the additional support and the adjustments that they might need to make in school to be more supportive. So it would be well worth a conference call with Krista and her team who run My Time down there, Emma.
Brilliant. Thanks, Simon. I know My Time have got an education summit coming up at the end of the month, which I know someone from the Children's Commissioners team is going along to, which is really great. So, but no, definitely agree. It'd be good to link up with My Time. Charlotte, do you want to come in?
Yeah, just to say, really, we've just done a project, we're actually doing at the moment with, so we have, as I mentioned earlier, a programme that we do with schools similar to actually what was just said around kind of bespoke training for champions, but also the wider staff team. And we do have a school resource kit, which is around also trying to support them to identify and be thinking about young carers in schools and lesson plans and all sorts of things. But one of the things that came up recently was that the young carers champions and some of the schools are working at fantastic and really established, but interestingly, they're not always the staff that are dealing with attendance. So we've been doing a piece of work with the attendance services in Cambridgeshire to put on some really targeted sessions for people in schools that are the attendance leads, and also us, and then the attendance services at the county council. So that's been a really interesting piece of work, and obviously, there's some interesting stuff that's come from that. So I'll think about maybe what would be helpful to share from that.
Brilliant, thanks, Charlotte. And I'm going to be putting out in the Alliance bulletin that goes out that sort of that call for anyone if they have got any useful resources or things that you might want to share as well. In terms, Simon mentioned about in terms of that sort of capacity building work. I know Charlotte touched about it, and Paul, I know obviously in your slot earlier you talked about the work that you've been doing with your sort of accreditation with universities. So I didn't know if you wanted to come in and just talk a little bit about that work, about the work you're doing there, and then see Tracy's put her hand up, so I'll bring in Tracy next.
Yeah, thanks, Andy. And I put the links to those award toolkits in the chat just a minute ago. In our toolkits for universities, there's the award toolkit. There's one specific for universities and one for colleges, and they're built in across 3 themes, which is identification is the main theme and the criteria that sits under there within the award. And the second one is support, and there's criteria that sits under there. And the third one is on report, and also about celebrating practice within institutions. So the first part of the criteria is very much about whether colleges and universities establish a working group, looking at how they define who a carer is within their institutions, looking at aspects of their intent, their widening access, and their internal structures really around student carers, and whether they offer reduced admissions or contextualised admissions as part of that process. Whereas the second part of the award, and it's an award points-based system depending on the evidence that they can provide that they are meeting those criteria, whereas the second part very much looks at when students are on campus, what support are they getting? Is there that name contact? Do they get offered an individual support plan at college or university? Throughout that process, does the college or university have a clear student carer policy, a bespoke policy specifically relating to supporting student carers through that aspect? And then the third aspect's on reporting, and that's also looking at staff training and looking at how are they collecting data on student carers, and also looking at the journey of student carers and what are they learning from that through those award processes. And that's been really useful for embedding a whole institution approach, because I think you can, from our experience of before we introduced the award, we did bits of these pieces of work, but that really didn't help us to get to that whole institution approach before we were able to actually have a framework for them to work towards, which really helped.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Paul. And I think it really mirrors a lot with what's been done with sort of other initiatives, both nationally, so things like Young Carers in Schools programme, but also lots of young care organisations have similar sort of models for accreditation for schools. So to see something that's working for universities is sort of really encouraging from that perspective. Tracy, I thought you had your hand up earlier. Did you want to come in, share your experiences?
Oh, yeah, thanks. I'd like to have a chat with Paul at some point, actually, because I've been trying to do a lot of work with our local universities about young carers' experiences once we've done all this work through widening participation schemes to recruit them, but what are we doing to retain them and support them through their journey at university? But going back to attendance at school and college for young carers, I just wanted to bring up issues, particularly in rural communities such as Warwickshire, where transport is lengthy and expensive, and the 16 to 19 bursary, and young carers may be having to have a prolonged period of absence from school or college to provide care to somebody who's particularly ill at a particular time or worse. and therefore they automatically go below a nationally set threshold that means their bursary is stopped, and then they can't get to college and get that attendance level back up to reinstate the bursary. We're having to fund that kind of thing so that they can continue to attend college and get back to a point in their admission, in their attendance levels where the bursary kicks back in, which does seem a little bit discriminatory in places, and just sets them up to fail a little bit, I feel. So it'd be nice to see, like we've got Solihull College and Stratford College in Warwickshire and West Midlands have done the Carers Covenant, and they've got a lower attendance requirement for young carers. They've lowered it to 75%, which most of them manage to maintain above, and therefore don't lose that travel support and that meal when they're in college through the bursary. So I didn't know whether that's something that could be looked at on a more sort of national level, just to sort of keep the playing field a bit fairer.
Definitely, and I know from a higher education perspective, I'll come to college in a second, but unfortunately couldn't make it today, but I met with a member, one of Paul's colleagues at Carers Trust, to look at actually from a national perspective in relation to England, what can be done, what are some of the issues, what are some of the barriers from that perspective. So I think what you said, Tracy, and what Paul also said earlier, there's no point doing a lot of work to try and get young carers into, whether it's further education or higher education, if they don't A, stay there, and B, in terms of achieve the experience and the outcome that they have got the potential and should be able to do. And so I think that's where you've got people like Office for Students have got a key role to play within this, in relation to actually what are they doing to actually make sure that young carers are on the radar from that perspective. As well. But no, I think definitely there's a lot to be done in terms of nationally to look at what are some of the barriers, what are some of the practical issues. The same stuff, the same conversations we've been having with young carers in schools for the past decade really is sort of got us probably to where we are today. The fact that actually finally the school census is going to include young carers. Children's Commissioner's paper coming out next week calling for young carers champion, young carers policy. These are things that young carers organisations have been calling for a number of years. So actually having them in terms of raised on a sort of national scale will really, really help as well. Just got time for one more final observation or question before I sort of round off to make sure we finish on time. If anyone's got any questions? No. Just to say, in terms of the, as I said, the slides, the recordings and everything will be shared sort of afterwards as well. I will also be planning to share the extracts from the chat so that people can sort of pick up where people have shared contact details or people have said links to resources and things from that perspective as well. But I think just to close today's session, I just want to say a huge thank you to everyone who's given up the start of their Carers Week. I know it is a really busy week for everyone involved in the world of young carers. But I think today we've heard from a range of different backgrounds, from research, from policy, from practice, just some of the issues that are happening. And I think as we've just had the conversation, there are so many pockets of great work happening, and there's lots of really good examples of where it's working well. I think one of the key issues is actually how do we make sure that this is business as usual? How do we make sure this is consistent? So I think there's been a lot of work nationally over the past couple of years to look at what's happening with young carers assessments under the Children and Families Act. And again, there are still areas where that's patchy, if I'm being sort of fair to say. But I think when it comes to transitions assessments for young adult carers, I think we are a good few years behind. I think it's asking who is asking the questions to make sure that A, these assessments are happening, but B, they're delivering the outcomes that are needed from that perspective. So I think that's one of the key areas. I think there's been a lot of conversation about support for students in further and higher education, but also not forgetting those who want to go into employment. How do we make sure they are able to get into the workforce and that employers understand not just the skills and benefits that young carers bring to their workforce, but also actually why being flexible isn't just something nice to do, but it's actually something that carers got the rights to do around rights to flexible working. There's campaigns obviously around unpaid carers leave coming in, again, continuing some of that work from that perspective. But also, as we touched upon earlier, how do we make sure from a commissioning standpoint that actually the needs of young carers and young adult carers are being commissioned? So in some areas, transition support is very much part of the commissioned activity, yet in other areas it's not. So that's left down to the individual provider to say, what can we afford to do with the envelope that's there? And we know often the funding isn't enough to meet the needs of all the young carers who need it. But how do we make sure that it takes that age and stage approach for young carers from sort of in primary school in year 6 to 7, that sort of year 9 onwards from that perspective, into post-16 provision, and then into the world of adult services. And that's not just about services, that's also around data sharing. It's around that partnership working that Andrew talked about earlier from that perspective. But then also making sure, how do we make sure that the service meets the need of this particular cohort? So whether you're looking at your year 6 young carers or you're looking at your 17, 18-year-old young carers, how do we make sure that the services on offer respond to their particular needs? And I think that's a really key one, particularly in areas where you don't have an all-age service, or you've got that distinct provision between young carers and also adult carers as well. But I think also for me, one of the final areas is around data. I think we've heard a lot about some really insightful findings around young carers, around young adult carers. But for me, one of the key areas and questions is, what happens to those young people when they're 21, 22, 24? Actually, are they making it into employment? Actually, what's happening around their mental well-being as they're approaching that age of adulthood from that perspective? And I think from a research perspective, it'd be really, really insightful to see actually what are the outcomes for young carers further down the line once they've left the arena of children's services or young carer services and are very much in the domain of adult carers. I think it'd be really insightful to see what's happening there from that perspective. So I just want to finish by saying a huge thank you to everyone who's attended today and giving up their time. I want to thank all of our speakers who've provided such rich insights, both into some of the issues being faced by young carers at transitions, but also some of the support that can help as well. Just to plug some of the upcoming events coming up. So Saul talked earlier on about having a rights-based approach to supporting young carers and young adult carers. And this is something that the Young Carers Alliance is looking to do. So looking to work with young carers and also members of the Alliance to develop a Bill of Rights and Responsibilities. So really setting out, these are the rights that we want every single young carer and young adult carer to have, but also these are the responsibilities that need to be in place to make that happen. Our next policy forum is going to be after the summer break, which is focusing on the young carers and the school census. So for those who aren't aware, the school census that schools do every term is going from the spring to include young carers for the first time. So this very much will be helping both schools, but also young carers organisations to understand what does it mean for them, what do they need to have in place to be ready for that. And this is something that ourselves at Caring Together and also through the wider Young Carers Alliance are really keen to make sure we have that national focus on to make sure that schools are ready for this. So actually understand what it means for you, but also what support's out there to enable you to be able to complete the census accurately from that perspective. And then the next version of this event is going to be on the 25th of November, which if all is as usual, is set to be Carers' Rights Day. And for this, it's going to be focusing on health. So we'll be focusing both on the sort of health needs of young carers and young adult carers, but also how do we improve the identification and support of young carers and young adult carers within health settings. Something that with the Health and Care Act really provides that opportunity to shine a light on from that perspective. So if anyone's not yet joined the Young Carers Alliance and wants to, the details are on there. If you go to the website, it's free of charge. People can sign up as individuals or on behalf of their organisation if they're able to as well. And I really would encourage people to get involved. I think some of the conversations we've seen today are exactly why the Alliance was formed, to share best practice, to collaborate, to learn from others, and to help provide that strong collective voice for young carers, young adult carers and their families. So all that's left for me to say is again, a huge thank you to everyone for giving up their time for joining today. And I hope you all have a brilliant Carers Week. Thank you ever so much, everyone. See people soon.